Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into something pretty fascinating, the world of sports psychology.
Oh, yeah.
But with a focus on Africa.
Right.
It's a continent where sports isn't just about like physical abilities. It's really intertwined with like cultural beliefs, societal structures, all that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you see that a lot. Modern sports psychology kind of meets those more traditional practices. It's really interesting kind of clash sometimes.
It is. And that's what we're going to be digging into today. Our main source for this deep dive is Sports Psychology and Performance in Africa. It's by Cheikh, SARR.
Great book.
Yeah. And, I'll be honest, where I first saw the title, I was like, okay, sports psychology, I get it.
Yeah.
But this book goes so much deeper.
Oh, it does.
It's not just about the typical like visualization techniques.
Right.
It gets into how mystical practices and beliefs are like woven into athletics in Africa.
It's like a whole other layer of the mental game. It's something that, we don't often think about. Even SARR talks about mystical professionals.
Mystical professionals.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
It's fascinating. Like they're actually playing a role in training and competition.
Wow. So before we get to all those fascinating details, let's sort of set the stage here. How does SARR actually define sport?
Well, he breaks it down into four main elements. You've got institutionalization, rules of the game, competition, and that need for physical or mental effort.
Right. Makes sense. Pretty straightforward, it seems like.
Yeah, pretty much the building blocks of any sport, you'd think.
Right.
But this is where it gets a little interesting. He uses that definition to kind of highlight these gray areas.
Oh, okay.
He talks about Senegalese striking wrestling specifically.
Okay.
Super popular in Senegal.
Oh, wow.
Organized competitions, passionate fans.
Okay.
The whole 9 yards. But it's not officially recognized by like international sporting bodies.
Interesting. So does that mean it doesn't really count as a sport then in the like official sense?
Well, that's the debate. SARR brings up this idea of what he calls cultural sports.
Cultural sports?
Yeah. They function like sports, right, within their own communities.
Oh, right.
But they might not perfectly fit those global definitions that we have.
I see. So it's less about like checking off boxes on a list.
Yeah.
And more about how that activity actually functions within its cultural context.
Right, exactly.
But this whole idea of cultural sports, that brings up some questions.
It does.
I mean, what are the implications of that being a cultural sport versus, like a globally recognized sport? Yeah,
that's a really great question. And it kind of leads us to one of the challenges facing modern sports, particularly in Africa.
Right.
A lot of those globally recognized sports, think like football or track and field, whatever, they often operate in environments with limited resources and in some cases, unstable governance.
Right. So when you have high stakes, fewer resources, I can see how that would lead to problems.
For sure.
Things like corruption, match fixing.
All of that.
Yeah.
And SARR argues, those challenges are even more amplified in Africa.
Makes sense.
Because sports often become this microcosm of the larger society.
Wait, can you unpack that a little? What does he mean by that? Sports reflecting societal dynamics.
Sure. Think of it like sport is almost a mirror, reflecting those power structures, the values, even the balance between competition and cooperation within a society.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So how a culture approaches competition in sports.
Yeah.
Could tell us something about how they approach it in like other areas of life.
Yeah, exactly. And SARR has some really cool examples of how that plays out.
Oh, like what?
He even talks about team names.
Team names.
Yeah. Imagine a culture where most of the teams are named after like fierce predators.
Oh, okay.
Lions, tigers, that sort of thing.
Right.
That might reflect that society's emphasis on aggression and dominance.
Like those team names are like little clues into the cultural psyche.
Yeah, exactly.
Suddenly those names become more than just like labels. They're like symbols.
They are. Exactly.
So if we really want to understand a culture's values, their power dynamics, we can look at the names they give their sports teams.
You got it.
And it gets even more complex when we start talking about politics, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because you can't talk about sports without acknowledging those political forces at play.
Especially on an international level.
Right.
Yeah, and SARR, he really gets into this whole relationship between sports and politics in Africa.
Okay.
He gives some powerful examples of how international events basically become these platforms for like national pride.
Yeah.
Political agendas.
Right.
Think about how governments will often use those events to project a certain image.
Of strength and unity.
Exactly. To the whole world.
Right. It goes beyond just governments, too.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, SARR also talks about how athletes use their platform to make political statements, protest injustices.
Right.
It's like sports becomes this battleground for all these competing ideologies.
Exactly. He brings up the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar specifically.
Oh, yeah.
There were so many controversies surrounding protests by players and fans.
Right. Like, remember all that tension around players wanting to wear those armbands?
Yes.
In support of LGBTQ plus rights?
Right.
It was like this constant push and pull between athletes using their platform and this idea that sports should somehow stay neutral.
Right.
It's like everyone's trying to figure out where the line is and who gets to draw it.
Exactly.
And speaking of complex dynamics, SARR doesn't shy away from addressing racism in African sports.
Right. Yeah. It's a huge issue.
It is, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a harsh reality.
It is.
And it really limits opportunities for so many athletes.
In so many ways.
Yeah, from like biased selection processes to like unequal access to training, resources, you name it.
It's heartbreaking, honestly, because it goes beyond just unfair treatment. It's really about systematically denying talented athletes the chance to like reach their full potential.
Exactly. It's a hostile environment in a lot of cases.
It is.
Even when someone overcomes all those obstacles, they're still facing so much prejudice, discrimination.
They're constantly having to prove themselves.
Yes.
It's a reminder that talent and hard work alone aren't always enough.
Right.
SARR even brings up the case of Mesut Ozil.
Oh, yeah.
The German footballer of Turkish origin.
All right.
Amazingly talented.
Yes.
But he ultimately left professional football because of the relentless racism he faced. It's a really powerful example of how ingrained that racism is.
It is, even at the highest levels.
Yeah. It just underscores how important it is to address these issues.
For sure. Okay, so we've laid out this like complex backdrop, right? The cultural influences, the societal pressures, all the political stuff.
Right.
Now, let's get to like the heart of what makes this episode so fascinating.
Yeah.
This whole unique landscape of sports psychology in Africa.
This is where the book gets really interesting. SARR highlights this paradox where even though there's this growing awareness of sports psychology as a field, it exists alongside these really deep-rooted magico-religious practices.
Right. So you have like these modern techniques for like mental training, performance enhancement. But those techniques are kind of intertwined with these beliefs and rituals that have been passed down for generations.
It really is. It's like this blend of the modern and the traditional.
Right. And it's not just athletes or fans who hold these beliefs.
Oh, no. It goes way beyond that. Even coaches, officials sometimes.
They'll attribute outcomes to mystical forces.
Wow.
It's fascinating.
I remember reading about Ivorian footballers.
Yeah.
Who actually attributed their victory in a major tournament to fetishists, which they then described as, quote, psychological trainers.
That's amazing.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, it really captures that paradox that SARR's talking about. It's like a glimpse into how traditional beliefs, in some cases, are filling the role that, you know, we might associate with a sports psychologist.
Right. Instead of like visualizing success or managing anxiety through breathing exercises.
Right.
They're consulting spiritual advisors, relying on rituals.
For that extra edge.
Right.
It totally changes how we think about what sports psychology can even look like.
It really does. Yep. And it leads to SARR's case study, right?
Yeah.
The Senegalese striking wrestling.
Right.
Where you have this push and pull between the modern and the traditional. Sports psychology takes on a whole other dimension. Okay, before we get into that, I think we need to like paint a picture for our listeners.
Yeah, good idea.
What exactly is Senegalese striking wrestling?
Okay, so imagine wrestling.
Okay.
But punches are allowed.
Wait, punches are allowed?
Full-on punches.
Oh, wow.
And no weight categories.
What?
Yeah, so you can have these totally mismatched opponents going at it.
It sounds brutal.
It is, and it's so deeply rooted in tradition, mystical beliefs.
Wow.
SARR talks about how wrestlers will often explain their success or failure through things like luck, spiritual guides, they're called marabouts, even curses.
Curses.
Yeah. It's not just about your physical strength technique. It's like this whole other layer of spiritual warfare.
Wow, that adds a whole other level of intensity to it.
It does.
So it's not just training your body. You're also trying to harness these unseen forces.
To gain an advantage.
To win.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So it's not just physical prowess. It's like mental fortitude, belief in those mystical forces.
It's all connected.
Wow. But how do those beliefs actually tie into this idea of sports psychology?
That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
It really is fascinating, like how those beliefs actually shape the whole psychological landscape of these sports.
It is.
And it's not just a passive belief system either.
Yeah.
You have actual practitioners. Remember we were talking about those mystical professionals earlier?
Right. The spiritual advisors, healers, marabouts, all of that.
Yeah. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how they all fit into this whole picture, though.
Me too.
Well, SARR calls them mystical professionals, which I think is a pretty good term for it, actually, because it suggests that we need to, take their role seriously.
Right. Not just dismiss it as superstition or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. That makes sense. So who are these mystical professionals then? And what do they actually do?
Well, their roles can vary a lot depending on the context. Sometimes it's a marabout, a spiritual guide with deep knowledge of those traditional beliefs and practices. They might provide charms, amulets for protection, or perform certain rituals to invoke good luck,
right,
ward off negative energy, things like that.
It's like having a spiritual coach in your corner.
Yeah, kind of. And then you have the healers, of course, who use traditional remedies to address physical or even psychological issues sometimes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they might use herbal concoctions, massage techniques, stuff like that to treat injuries, alleviate pain.
So it's like a holistic approach to well-being.
Right, exactly. Addressing both the physical and spiritual aspects of the athlete. SARR even mentions exorcism being used in some cases.
Exorcism. Wow. That's pretty intense.
It is. And it really highlights that blurry line between spiritual beliefs and what we might consider mental health.
Right.
In some cultures, what we might call anxiety or depression could actually be attributed to spiritual influences.
Wow. So the mystical professional isn't just treating the athlete's body then, but also their spirit, their mind, their emotions.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Right.
And SARR argues that this holistic approach is a big part of their appeal. They're not just treating symptoms, they're offering a sense of meaning, purpose even, within this larger belief system.
Which makes a lot of sense. If you really believe your performance is tied to these spiritual forces, then seeking guidance from someone who understands that realm
makes perfect sense. Yeah.
It's only natural.
And it really resonates in cultures where there's this strong emphasis on communalism, respect for elders, all that.
Right.
These mystical professionals often hold positions of authority within the community, so their advice is really important.
It's like they're not just advisors, but trusted, respected figures.
Yeah, exactly.
So their words hold a lot of weight.
They do.
Right.
But, SARR doesn't, completely endorse all these practices. He definitely acknowledges there can be some downsides, too.
Oh, okay. What are some of the potential downsides he talks about?
Well, he argues that if you rely too much on those mystical professionals, it can create a kind of dependency.
Okay.
Where athletes might start to believe that their success depends entirely on those external forces.
Right.
Rather than their own effort and ability.
So that brings us back to the whole external locus of control idea.
Exactly. If you believe that the outcome is predetermined or influenced by things you can't control, it can definitely affect your motivation.
Yeah. And your approach to training.
For sure. SARR also raises concerns about the potential for exploitation, too.
Right.
Think about a really vulnerable athlete, desperate for success.
Right.
They might be willing to do anything, follow anyone who promises that, quick fix, even if there's a cost.
That's a really good point. It's not everyone who claims to have these special powers or insights actually has the athlete's best interests at heart.
Exactly. And that cost can be financial, emotional, even spiritual.
Right.
So SARR's really cautious about blindly following anyone claiming mystical power. He encourages athletes to be discerning.
Right. Think critically.
Yeah, to really prioritize their own well-being.
It's like he's saying, don't just take everything at face value. Ask questions. Trust your gut.
Yeah, exactly.
So is he saying that those mystical professionals have no place in modern African sports?
Well, not necessarily. He actually suggests there's potential for collaboration there.
Oh, okay.
For finding ways to kind of bridge that gap between traditional practices and modern sports psychology.
That sounds like a much more nuanced approach for sure. How does he see that bridge being built then?
Well, he proposes a few key strategies. One is investing in training programs for local sports psychologists.
Okay.
But ones that really take into account the cultural context.
So they're not just importing Western psychological models wholesale.
No. It's about adapting them to those specific needs and beliefs.
Right. Understanding the culture and integrating those principles into the existing framework.
Exactly. Cultivating that homegrown expertise. And those programs need to go beyond just the typical curriculum too.
Okay. How so?
Well, aspiring sports psychologists in Africa, they need a deep understanding of those traditional beliefs, practices, but also the social and economic realities of those communities.
Right, because the athlete isn't just an individual, but part of that larger system.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that whole ecosystem.
Right, like we were saying before, you have to speak their language, not just literally, but culturally and socially to really connect with them.
That's a great way to put it. It's about cultural sensitivity, understanding. And that kind of leads to SARR's next point, which is about tailoring those interventions to the specific needs of African athletes.
So moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah. Recognizing that different cultures might need different strategies.
Right. It's about taking a more personalized approach.
Right.
Considering the individual and their background.
Exactly. And you know what? SARR gives this example of using storytelling and proverbs.
Interesting.
Which are so important to so many African cultures.
Right.
As a way to actually convey those psychological principles.
That's actually really clever. So it's about using those existing cultural tools, traditions, to make those ideas resonate more.
Right. You're tapping into something that's already familiar and meaningful.
Yeah. It's brilliant. It shows respect for that existing framework.
And he also suggests incorporating traditional healing practices.
Okay.
Like herbal remedies, rituals, into a more holistic approach.
So it's not about throwing out those old ways.
No, not at all. It's about finding a way to blend them, integrate them with those newer approaches.
I'm really seeing how strong that bridge between modern and traditional can be.
It can.
It's not an either situation.
Right. You find a way to make them work together. And, another thing SARR really emphasizes is collaboration.
Collaboration, yeah. I love how he brings that up.
It's so important. And it's not just about sports psychologists coming in and saying, this is how you do it.
Right. It's a much more inclusive approach.
Yeah, exactly. He's talking about getting everyone involved. Sports organizations, coaches, athletes themselves.
Right.
Even those mystical professionals we talked about. And the governments, too.
It really does take a village, doesn't it? To create real change, you need everyone working together, sharing what they know.
That's a great way to put it. Without that, all those efforts are just going to be fragmented.
Yeah, they won't be as effective.
Right. And he actually suggests creating Pan-African organization dedicated to promoting sports psychology, facilitating all that collaboration.
A Pan-African organization, that's a big idea.
It is. But can you imagine the impact?
It would be huge. This network of support, knowledge sharing, connecting people all across the continent.
Exactly. It would be a game changer. And it would send a powerful message, too.
Right. That this is a priority.
Yes.
Not just for athletes, but for the future of African sports as a whole.
Absolutely. It's about investing in that potential, recognizing that their success isn't just about physical talent.
Right. It's about nurturing their mental and emotional well-being as well.
Yeah. And that requires this holistic approach that really respects and integrates their heritage.
It does. But to do that, we need to understand how those athletes make sense of their experiences, right? How they explain their successes and their failures.
Right. And this is where SARR introduces this really interesting concept called the attribution theory approach.
Okay, the attribution theory approach. Tell me more about that.
So he uses this theory as a framework to understand how those wrestlers in Senegal, specifically in that striking wrestling we were talking about, how they understand their wins and losses. Remember how those Ivorian footballers credited their win to fetishists?
Right. Psychological trainers.
Exactly. It's kind of like that. But SARR takes a much deeper dive into the psychology behind it.
Okay, I'm following. So how does this attribution theory actually play out in Senegalese wrestling?
Well, he did this study where he interviewed all these wrestlers about their experiences. And he found some pretty interesting patterns in how they explained those wins and losses.
Oh, like what?
So when they talked about their successes, they often attributed it to their own skill.
Okay, makes sense.
Your training, dedication, sometimes even luck.
Right. So they take ownership of their wins.
Yeah, but then when they lost, the explanations changed.
Oh, how so?
Then they tend to point to these external factors like their their opponent's strength, having a bad day, or even the influence of like mystical forces like curses or a lack of spiritual protection.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it's like they take credit when they win, but look for outside reasons when they lose to kind of protect their ego, maybe?
Yeah. You got it. It's easier to blame external forces than to admit you just weren't good enough that day.
Right. Exactly.
And it speaks to the power of those cultural beliefs, too.
Yeah.
If you truly believe those outside forces can influence the match, then it makes sense to explain a loss that way.
Right. It's a way to maintain your self-worth, your belief in your abilities, even when you don't get the outcome you want.
Yeah. It's like saying, okay, I lost, but it wasn't because I was lacking. It was something outside of me.
Right.
It's a way to preserve your confidence and keep going. But SARR doesn't see it as entirely negative, though.
Oh, really? He sees some positives in that.
He does.
Yeah.
He argues that attributing a loss to something external can actually be a healthy coping mechanism.
Okay, now that's a twist. How can blaming something outside of yourself be healthy?
Well, think about it. It lets those athletes maintain their self-belief, their motivation, even after a defeat.
Yeah.
If you genuinely think you lost because of bad luck or a particularly strong opponent that day, you're less likely to get discouraged.
Right. It's like they're saying, okay, this one didn't go my way, but I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm going to learn from it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where SARR's work gets even more interesting. He doesn't just describe these patterns. He actually suggests ways to use them to help athletes develop a more resilient mindset.
So instead of trying to completely erase those beliefs in mystical forces, he's saying we should find ways to work with them.
Exactly. It's about understanding that cultural context and integrating those modern psychology techniques that fit.
Right. Recognizing that those beliefs are really deeply ingrained and they hold cultural significance.
It's about finding that balance, respecting their traditions and beliefs, but also empowering them with those new tools.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like? In practice, I mean.
Sure. Let's say you're working with a wrestler who really believes in the power of marabouts. You might acknowledge that belief, but then help them focus on what they can control. Their training, their technique, their pre-match rituals. You're shifting the focus from the uncontrollable to the controllable.
So it's not about dismissing their belief system, but helping them find a sense of agency within it.
Exactly. And you might even use stories or examples from their own culture to kind of highlight the importance of effort, resilience.
Right. Using their existing framework, their stories, their beliefs to empower them.
It's about meeting them where they are and using their own language to communicate those ideas.
I really like that approach. It seems much more respectful and effective than just trying to impose a whole new system on them.
It is, and it builds trust, too.
Right.
If that athlete feels like you understand and respect their beliefs, they're going to be much more open to what you have to say.
It creates that safe space for them to explore those new ideas without feeling like they're betraying their culture, their heritage.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From those unique challenges and opportunities in African sports to that complex relationship between mystical practices and modern psychology. But I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the bigger picture here. Well, this book isn't just an academic exercise. It's a call to action. SARR is really pleading for more investment, more research, more support for developing sports psychology in Africa.
Yeah, you're right. He's not just describing the landscape. He's pushing us to do something about it.
Exactly. And that's where his concluding chapter comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's like a roadmap for how to build a more robust and culturally relevant up to sports psychology in Africa.
He did.
He gives specific steps that organizations, coaches, even governments can take to really support those athletes, help them reach their full potential.
He does, but I think we should save those steps for the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, good idea. Let's leave our listeners with this thought, though.
Okay.
Imagine what African sports could achieve if we truly embraced the power of sport psychology in all its complex, culturally nuanced glory.
It's an exciting thought.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into sports psychology in Africa. And like we promised, we're going to explore that roadmap SARR lays out for creating a more robust and culturally relevant approach to the field.
Yeah, it's really a blueprint for change. And he starts by addressing, a really fundamental problem, the lack of resources for sports psychology, especially in a lot of African countries.
You talk about funding, right?
Yeah, exactly. The financial resources needed to support those programs.
For training, research, hiring support staff, all of that.
All of that, yeah. He argues that without enough investment, it's always going to be seen as like a luxury.
Right. Instead of a necessity.
Right.
It's like trying to build a house without any bricks, you know?
Yeah. You need that foundation.
You need that solid foundation to create something that lasts.
Exactly. And he also points out the need for more qualified sports psychologists in Africa.
Well, yeah, I imagine there's a shortage of people who are trained and understand those cultural nuances we keep talking about.
Absolutely. So he suggests creating more university programs, certification courses, things like that, that meet international standards. But they also have to take into account that specific cultural context.
Right. So it's not just about importing knowledge from the West.
No.
It's about developing expertise from within Africa.
Exactly. Building that capacity. And those training programs, he says, they need to go beyond, the typical sports psych curriculum.
Oh, interesting. What does he mean by that?
Well, he says that those aspiring sports psychologists, they need to really understand traditional beliefs and practices, but also the social and economic realities of those communities.
Right, because the athlete isn't just an individual. They're part of this whole larger system.
Yeah, exactly. You have to recognize that.
So like we were talking about with those mystical professionals, you have to speak their language,
Yeah.
to build trust and rapport, not just literally, but culturally and socially as well.
That's a great way to put it. Cultural sensitivity is so key. And that leads to SARR's next point, which is about tailoring those interventions to the specific needs of African athletes.
So not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No.
Recognizing that different cultures might benefit from different strategies.
Exactly. And he gives this really cool example using storytelling and proverbs.
Well, interesting.
Which, they're central to so many African cultures.
Right.
Because you can use them to actually convey those psychological principles.
It's brilliant. You're tapping into those existing tools and traditions.
Yeah, making those ideas more relatable, more memorable.
It's about meeting them where they are.
Exactly. And he also suggests incorporating traditional healing practices as well.
Okay, like what?
Herbal remedies, rituals, things like that, into a more holistic approach.
So it's not about throwing those traditions out the window.
No, it's about finding a way to blend them, integrate them, make them work together.
Yeah. I really love how SARR emphasizes collaboration throughout the book.
Me too. It's so important. And he's not just talking about the sports psychologists themselves.
Right. He's advocating for a much more inclusive approach.
Yes, he is. He wants everyone on the same page. Sports organizations, the coaches, the athletes, even those mystical professionals, and the governments too. Everyone has a role to play.
It really does take a village, like they say. To support an athlete, you need that whole community.
That's such a great analogy. You need everyone working together, sharing what they know.
Without that, all those efforts are just going to be less effective.
Yeah, they'll be fragmented. And, SARR even suggests creating like a Pan-African organization.
A Pan-African organization?
Yeah, dedicated to promoting sports psychology and making all that collaboration happen.
Wow. That's a pretty big vision.
It is. But think about the impact if it actually happened.
It would be huge. It would be this incredible platform for sharing knowledge, resources, best practices all across the continent.
Exactly. It would be a total game changer.
It would send a really powerful message too, right?
Yeah, that this is a priority.
That it's not just for individual athletes, it's for the future of African sports.
Absolutely. It's about investing in that potential. Recognizing that their success isn't just about physical ability.
Right. It's about their mental and emotional well-being, too.
It's about seeing the whole athlete.
The whole person.
Yeah, and respecting their cultural background.
Fostering that sense of support and understanding where athletes feel empowered to embrace both their traditions and the latest scientific knowledge.
And ultimately, it's about helping them not just compete,
but to thrive.
Yeah.
Well, what a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of sports psychology in Africa. It's been a really eye-opening journey. And I, for one, am really excited to see how this field keeps developing and how it empowers athletes across the continent.
Me too. There's so much potential there. It's really exciting.
It is. Well, until next time, keep diving deep and keep exploring the world with curiosity and an open mind.